going to do lecture 25, which is the endocrine system. This would have been complemented with an endocrine lab where we would have looked at the different organs in the cadavers. But since we're not going to be doing that, I figure I can just do the lecture and you can identify essentially the organs as we go through them in lecture. So, starting off with the endocrine system is a collection of glandular tissue. Essentially, the endocrine system is all over the body, from the brain all the way down through your thoracic and abdominal viscera. When we look at endocrine tissue, it's almost every tissue in your body can function in an endocrine manner. The idea with the endocrine system is that you have this system of glandular tissue that functions to coordinate and control other cells. They coordinate, control what we call target tissue. And when I say control, I mean change or alter the activity of the cells that are receiving those endocrine signals. When I first learned this, I thought, well, that kind of sounds like the nervous system. So if you have an endocrine system and its job is to control and coordinate target tissue, how is that any different than the nervous system that controls and coordinates target tissue? And the answer is, well, they pretty much do the same thing. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between these two systems, but they do the controlling in a very different manner. When we look at the endocrine system, we look at a system that has extremely fast communication that's very direct. So you have the cells that will be sending those really fast moving action potentials. We're looking at milliseconds of time that pass between the release of a signal to the effector tissue versus the endocrine system where you're looking at sometimes a few minutes to hours for the signal to arrive at the target tissue. So when we're looking at the endocrine system, we're looking at a controlling system, but a system that's much, much slower than the nervous system. We're also looking at a system that doesn't have direct lines of communication. You might think, well, that's not an advantage, but in the sense of the endocrine system, it functions to be an advantage because now you can release a substance into the surrounding tissue. The mechanism for delivery is your cardiovascular system and lymphatics, where the highway's already laid out. The transport system is already there as part of the circulatory system and movement of fluids within us. So expense-wise, endocrine cells expend very little in distributing their message. They basically secrete it outside in the cells, and the distribution essentially is body fluid. Their message may last for much longer periods of time. So it kind of depends on the stability of the hormone, but it may circulate for minutes to hours to days to weeks to months within the body. This works really well when you want a signal to last for a longer period of time. So for example, growth signals, repair signals, a signal that may be involved in development of tissue. Those signals you want to last for a long time. So growth hormone is a hormone that controls the metabolism and growth of our body that doesn't have to be instantaneously driven and can occur over a long period of time. When you think about the reproductive systems, the production of sex cells takes quite some time. For testes, you're looking at sperm that are going to have, 74 days or 9 weeks of development within the male. So that's a long time that you're going to be stimulating them. So if you have a system of communication that's really inexpensive for distribution and has a wide distribution throughout the body, so if you have multi-system stimulation and you don't need it to be quick or instantaneous, the endocrine system is absolutely the definite way to go. Obviously, you don't want pain reception to be mediated by the endocrine system, because if you stepped on something, you'd have to wait until the cardiovascular system circulated that message all the way around. So that wouldn't be a great way to manage responses like that. So with all of that, let's look at some of the details of the endocrine system. I'm going to start off with a quick video, and then we'll look at some more of the organs and tissues and what they're secreting and how they're doing that.
The endocrine system is one of the two systems that are responsible for communication and integration between various body tissues, the other being the nervous system. Endocrine communication is achieved by means of chemical messengers called hormones. Hormones are produced in endocrine glands and secreted into the bloodstream to reach body tissues. A hormone can travel wherever the blood goes, but it can only affect cells that have receptors for it. These are called target cells. There are two major types of hormones: steroid hormones derived from cholesterol and are lipid soluble, and non-steroid hormones derived from peptides or amino acids and are water soluble. Lipid soluble steroid hormones can cross the cell membrane to bind to their receptors inside the cells, either in the cytoplasm or nucleus. Steroid hormone receptors are typically transcription factors. Upon forming, the hormone receptor complex binds to specific DNA sequences to regulate gene expression, and thus mediating cellular response. On the other hand, water-soluble non-steroid hormones are unable to cross the lipid membrane and therefore must bind to receptors located on the surface of the cell. The binding triggers a cascade of events that leads to production of CAMP, a second messenger that is responsible for cellular response to hormone. It does so by changing enzyme activity or ion channel permeability. Major endocrine glands include the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, pineal gland, thyroid and parathyroid glands, thymus, adrenal gland, islets of the pancreas, and testes in men or ovaries in women. The endocrine system also includes hormone-secreting cells from other organs, such as kidneys and intestines. Except for the hypothalamus and the pituitary, different endocrine glands are involved in different, more or less independent processes. For example, the pancreas produces insulin and glucagon that keep blood sugar levels in check. The parathyroid glands produce hormones that regulate calcium and phosphorus. Thyroid hormones control metabolic rates, while the ovaries and testes are involved in reproductive functions. On the other hand, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland play a more central, integrative role. The hypothalamus is also part of the brain. It secretes several hormones called neurohormones, which control the production of other hormones by the pituitary. Thus, the hypothalamus links the nervous system to the endocrine system. The pituitary is known as the master gland because it controls the functions of many other endocrine glands. A major role of the endocrine system is to maintain the body's stable internal conditions, or homeostasis, such as blood sugar levels or serum calcium levels. To do this, it utilizes negative feedback mechanisms, which work very much like a thermostat. The heater is on when the temperature is low, off when it's high. For example, when blood glucose level is high, such as after a meal, glucose induces insulin release from the pancreas. Insulin helps body cells consume glucose, clearing it from the blood. Low blood glucose can no longer act on the pancreas, which now stops releasing insulin. Another example is the regulation of thyroid hormone levels, which are induced by a pituitary hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. TSH, in turn, is under control of thyrotropin-releasing hormone, TRH, from the hypothalamus. When thyroid hormone levels are too high, they suppress the secretion of TSH and TRH, consequently inhibiting their own production. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos...
All right. So a little background to the endocrine system and how hormones work. Basically, hormone means to excite or arouse. So when we're talking about hormones, we're looking at these chemicals that function to excite or arouse or change the biological activity of a target cell. A target cell is any cell in the body that's going to have a receptor for that particular chemical, that hormone. So if I look at this very simplistic drawing, I have over here an endocrine cell. So that could be anything. It could be one of the follicular cells in the thyroid follicles. It could be one of the beta cells in the pancreas. It's going to release its biologically active molecule outside of itself. And then the body fluids would then function to circulate it. If it's going to act locally, it may do that. So, for example, when we looked at our testis, we know that in the testis we have interstitial cells that make testosterone that are going to affect the seminiferous tubules activity as part of spermatogenesis. It's going to have a local effect, but then it may be picked up by circulating blood and be carried to our bones that enhance bone density. It may be moving to your axillary glands to promote the production of sweat. It may be moving to our muscle to increase muscle mass. So they can circulate throughout the body as well as acting locally. When they circulate, they're going to basically be randomly bouncing around. And so it's really just a matter of concentration and time where a hormone will actually come in contact with a target cell. So unlike the nervous system where there's a direct connection, here it's a very vast connection. It's basically body fluids that circulate. Remember, blood is going to come within a millimeter of every metabolically active cell. And so this is a really great system because you're going to deliver this fluid to every active cell. And if you're a target cell, you're going to have a receptor for it. That's how you identify targets. Unlike following the little axon to the target, here we're just going to have to wait and see what cell changes its activity. The target cell will change its activity, will do something different specifically because of the binding of that particular hormone. So we call that the biological response. So for example, you might have antidiuretic hormone, which is secreted by the pituitary and then binds to cells within the kidney to change the reabsorption of water. So you'd be reabsorbing more water, so you would have less urine produced. That's what's called an antidiuretic. So a diuretic would allow urine to just basically be produced in high volumes, so you wouldn't have the reabsorption. So that would be the biological response. So these chemical messages that are released and oftentimes are very similar to neurotransmitters. In some cases, they may be almost the same, like epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine's the hormone version, norepinephrine's the neurotransmitter, and they actually have the same activity on their target cell, just depends on how they're released. So an endocrine gland can be anywhere in the body. It can be part of a cluster of cells that primarily serves that function, or it may be embedded within cells that do other things. In this case, we look at basically just a cell that secretes a biologically active molecule. It's typically distributed by the secretory system, but really just by body fluids. And when it reaches a target cell, there's going to be a receptor that binds that molecule and initiates a biological response. So if you have a cell like this little guy down here that has no receptors, it's going to be quiescent. It's going to be quiet and have no response, versus these guys that have receptors, and they will bind to that hormone. They'll be excited by it and will initiate some change in their activity. So I mentioned that hormones means to excite. There's two major kinds of hormones. So as outlined in the little video, there are steroid hormones, which are produced from a precursor of cholesterol. What's unique about steroid hormones is that they are lipid soluble, which means they dissolve really well in lipid-based substances like fats and oils and cell membranes. Or they're going to be amino acid or protein based. And those are typically amino acids or dipeptides, and they are water soluble. So you have water soluble hormones and you have lipid soluble hormones. The difference really for these guys is one, how they're carried in the plasma. Steroid hormones have to be carried on a transport protein like an albumin. Versus the amino acid based or protein based hormones where they're already soluble. So they can just be secreted as is and then can circulate. When they approach their target cell, the receptors are located in very different places, and the activity that results is very different. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble, which means they can diffuse right through the cell membranes. They do not have receptors on the surface. And so typically when the hormone binds its receptor, those receptors are internal within the cell. And usually they're going to change the protein synthesis. So they're typically transcription factors. That means that you're going to change the very essence of what the cells are doing. For our amino acid base, the receptors always have to be in the cell membrane. So they're fairly easy to identify because it's almost like having a big sign on your door. These guys have receptors in the membrane. And when they bind, they're going to initiate a cascade of responses that already has to be sort of pre-laid out. And so it's more like a domino effect. As soon as the receptor's bound at the membrane, it'll set up a series of cascading responses. So one thing leads to another, so they're already pre-described. So when you take physio, and many of you I'm hoping will take it either this summer or next semester, you'll have an opportunity to learn more about these signaling mechanisms. All right, so basic is steroid hormones, lipid-soluble receptors inside the cells, amino acid-based hormones, receptors are on the surface of the cells, and you're going to initiate a cascade of responses. So effector tissue, like how do you know what is the effector tissue for a endocrine cell? Well, same for nervous tissue cells, they're always going to be muscle or glands. But in this case, we're looking at cells where you have effectors being defined by having a receptor. So any cell that has a receptor for the hormone is considered a target cell. So here we have a secreting cell, this would be our endocrine cell, and we have a cell over here that has receptors for it, so this would be our target cell. All right, so an example of a biological response, we talked a little bit about this when we dealt with the kidney, but let's say you were dehydrated. So either you're eating lots of salty foods, or maybe you haven't had water in a little while, or maybe you were out jogging and you're sweating. So whatever reason, you're dehydrated. What happens when there's less body water in you is that the electrolyte composition and concentration increases. And so that's actually measured in what we call osmolalities. That just means that your concentration of stuff in your body fluids is getting really high because there's less water to dissolve it. So in your hypothalamus, you have these little receptors that can sense your body fluid concentration. And when that goes up, it triggers the hypothalamus to release a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. So that's that ADH. ADH will then travel from the hypothalamus through the posterior pituitary throughout the body, and eventually will arrive at the level of the collecting duct within the kidneys, and it will cause the kidneys to reabsorb water. And when it reabsorbs water or retains that water, it means you're not going to pee it out, which is why it's called antidiuretic. Diuresis means to pee, so this is an anti-peeing hormone. It will keep water within you, and hopefully with that, you can also stimulate a drinking response because you're going to feel thirsty, and that will help to increase our blood volume and our blood pressure, and more importantly in this case, decrease our blood concentration by retaining water. That's one of the reasons they say if you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated, because that's actually the signal that tells us that we need to drink, is the fact that we're already dehydrated. So this would be an example of a biological response. So the hormone is signaling the kidney cells to do something, and what they're going to do is make little, or actually cause the insertion of water channels into their membranes. Okay, so there's lots of tissue that's endocrine. In fact, even the heart is an endocrine structure, as it secretes a hormone called atrial natriuretic factor, which is associated with sodium regulation. But what we're going to do is hit just what I call the endocrine system's big hitters, like the really big guns in this system. So we're going to look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary. We're going to look at the thyroid and parathyroid. We're going to talk a little bit about thymus. And then we're going to hit the adrenal glands, a teeny bit on kidney, pancreas, and then, of course, we've already talked about the ovary and the testes. So for the endocrine system, we're going to focus just on 11 of these primary glands. Again, we're going to talk about the hypothalamus, which you might think, what? How can that be part of our endocrine system? I thought it was the nervous system. And it is both, because we want to be able to have a crossover between the endocrine system and the nervous system, because they're controlling the same, or I should say, they're doing the same kinds of things, and that means controlling tissue. We need them to have sort of a cross communication, and where that cross communication occurs is at the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus, pituitary. We talked a little bit about the pineal gland as part of the nervous tissue. Thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, adrenal glands, kidneys, pancreas, ovary, and testes. So what I'm going to do is go through each of these really quickly, and then spend a little bit more time on that pituitary gland, which is really important. All right, so the pituitary gland is often referred to as the master endocrine gland because it is going to be releasing 9 hormones, secreting 9 hormones. It actually makes 7. 2 of them are actually made in the hypothalamus and secreted through the pituitary gland. So you have to be really careful on how you say this. So it secretes 9 or releases 9 hormones, but actually produces 7 of them. Their job is throughout the entire body. The pituitary hormones are going to control many other endocrine glands. So for example, the pituitary is going to be controlling the adrenal gland. The pituitary is going to be controlling the thyroid gland. The pituitary is going to be controlling the testis. The pituitary is going to be controlling the ovaries. So we're going to see the pituitary gland is going to have this commanding role over many other endocrine glands. Remember that when we looked at the skulls in the very beginning of our semester, we were talking about the sphenoid bone, and the sphenoid bone was that backbone. It's sort of the keystone of the skull. It's right in the center. And right in the center of the sphenoid bone is that concavity called the sella turcica. And that's exactly where the pituitary gland sits. The pituitary gland is about 0.5 gram, so it's pretty small. It's about the size of a little pea, so it sits inside that sella turcica. It's really an outgrowth of the hypothalamus. In fact, there's going to be neurons that have soma in the hypothalamus, in nuclei within the hypothalamus, and then axons that run from the hypothalamus into the pituitary gland. So we're going to spend some time at the end of this lecture talking about that connection and the hormones and all the great stuff about the pituitary gland. So what I'm going to do is leave it there, and then we're going to come back to this, and we're going to look at all these different hormones. So again, if you look, you can see ADH and oxytocin are the 2 that are made in the hypothalamus. The rest of them are actually made in the pituitary. And you can see just holistically how far and wide-ranging the effects are for these hormones. So we're going to talk a teeny bit about the hypothalamus, and I'm going to spend more time at the end. So the hypothalamus makes actually 2 hormones within nuclei that exist in the hypothalamus, and those 2 hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. What's unique about these is the fact that they're nervous tissue cells that are going to have sensory information coming in to dendrites, and they'll release essentially from terminal endings, right, the synaptic knobs, chemicals that we would normally say are neurotransmitters, but they're not secreted into a synaptic cleft. They're basically just going to get secreted into a capillary bed. And so we're going to not be able to call them neurotransmitters, and that's why we're going to change their name to hormones. So oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are called hormones because they're released into capillary beds and then carried via the cardiovascular system, even though they're made by a nervous tissue cell. So we call the neurons neuroendocrine. So we'll also look at the hypothalamus that will be releasing 7 hormones that directly control the pituitary gland. And we're going to call these releasing hormones. So we're going to have, for example, a hormone that will stimulate the pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. So the hypothalamus will release thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone. It sounds pretty crazy. But anyway, we'll talk more about this. But again, the hypothalamus is going to be controlling secretion coming from the pituitary gland in addition to making two hormones of its own. You guys already know the hypothalamus is in the diencephalon, so that's going to be just immediately below the thalamus, just immediately behind where the optic nerve crosses over and directly in front of where the mammillary bodies are. All right, so we can see here, this is a beautiful drawing showing us in yellow. These are the hypothalamic neurons that function as neuroendocrine cells. It's kind of neat to see them up here. You'll see the axons, it's going to extend down to this infundibulum. And instead of releasing onto a effector cell, they're going to release into a little capillary bed here. And that's why the secretions from these neurons are now called hormones. So these are called neuroendocrine cells. The blue ones over here, these are also neuroendocrine cells. They're going to release hormones into a small capillary bed up here at the beginning of the infundibulum. And then those are going to move just to the anterior pituitary, stimulating anterior pituitary cells to make and secrete their hormones. So these are going to be making what we call releasing hormones. So again, we'll talk more about this at the end of this lecture. All right, so let's move into some of the other glands. We're going to look at 11 glands. The pineal gland we've also talked a tiny bit about. It's referred to also as the epiphysis. Epi means above and physis means growth. So the growth being the brain, essentially, the telencephalon. So it's kind of a growth above that. So the epiphysis is actually often referred to as the third eye because it does have connections to the retina. When the retina is receiving light, that actually inhibits the pineal gland from making a hormone called melatonin. So when the retina is not actually getting stimulated, it then actually synapses with the pineal gland and stimulates the production, or actually it doesn't inhibit the production of melatonin. And so the pineal gland actually makes the highest concentration of melatonin when it's dark. And this hormone is involved in setting up our internal body rhythms, which we call circadian rhythms. So remember, the pineal gland is just posterior to the corpus callosum. So this is a nice view of a mid-sagittal brain. Here's that corpus callosum. And we're looking at the colliculi here. So that's superior colliculus. And sandwiched in between those two, this is the pineal gland. Okay, so this is a little bit of a magnified view of the pineal gland right there. This would be the back end of where the corpus callosum would be, right there. And this is the front edge of the supracolliculus. In fact, here's the mesencephalic aqueduct, right? The Sylvian aqueduct or the cerebral aqueduct. That's this guy right there. All right, so that's a little pineal gland. Oftentimes, if people are having issues with quality or depth of sleep, you can go to the grocery store or the pharmacy and you can actually buy over-the-counter melatonin, and it may help increase the quality and depth of sleep. Some people actually use it to correct for jet lag. So if you, well, of course, no one's going to be doing this for a while, but if you were to fly to Europe, you could take melatonin when you get there, and that can help you reset your clock. So you take it and then you go to sleep. All right. So next is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland we kind of touched on. I showed you in some of those cadaver videos, if you'd watched them, what the thyroid gland looks like. But it kind of looks like a butterfly or the letter H. The thyroid gland sits just immediately below the larynx and right in front of the trachea. In fact, it kind of covers a little bit of the cricoid cartilage. It has two larger portions, which would be kind of like the wings that wrap around, and it has an isthmus or narrowing that connects both of those larger portions of the gland on either side that goes right across the front of the trachea. You can actually feel your thyroid if you kind of take your fingers and you run them down from your mandible. So put on just underneath your jawbone and kind of run your finger and your thumb down. And right before you get to your clavicles, you're going to feel this kind of mound. So it's just right above where your clavicles are. And just around your trachea, you kind of feel this nice mound of a tissue there. That's your thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland does two major roles. It makes thyroid hormone, thyroxine, and it also makes calcitonin. We looked at this under the microscope at the very beginning of the semester, and it has this little circular or spherical, what they call follicles. They're these little sort of round shaped structures. They are about a 0.9 of a millimeter, so almost a millimeter in diameter, the largest ones, or maybe as small as 0.2 millimeters. And these little thyroid follicles are going to be producing thyroxine, which regulates your metabolism. If you have a thyroid goiter where the thyroid is not being correctly inhibited, it makes lots and lots of thyroxine. You can have someone who has issues with their metabolism. They tend to be really skinny. And then it also regulates the release of calcitonin that has a job in allowing us to absorb the calcium that circulates into our tissues. So it decreases blood calcium levels. So the thyroid gland regulates metabolism and also our circulating calcium levels. All right. Parathyroid gland, if you were to take the thyroid gland off and look behind it, the posterior surface of the thyroid gland has what are called the parathyroid glands. There's actually usually four little pea-sized glands that sit on the posterior aspect of the thyroid, and they make, conveniently, parathyroid hormone that are also involved in calcium regulation. Parathyroid hormone actually increases calcium levels, and calcitonin decreases calcium levels. So we're looking at this counterbalancing between these two hormones. So that's the parathyroid hormones. In this drawing here, you can see this is the anterior surface of the thyroid gland. And so if you were to take it off, and you can kind of see this concavity, this is where the trachea would have been sitting. And these are the little parathyroid glands kind of sitting on the back edge of the wider portion of the gland. All right. The thymus is a gland that isn't particularly active after puberty. It regresses significantly right after puberty, but its job is to make thymopoietin, which is involved in white cell production. In juveniles and children, it's actually quite large and very active at that point as the immune system is reaching its maturation. And you would see like a lot of glandular fleshy tissue sitting right over where the great vessels are. But it regresses to essentially this vestigial structure in the adult. So when we do a dissection of this tissue, you typically just get a lot of connective tissue there, and you don't really see a whole lot of glandular tissue left over. But the thymus in a younger person is involved. It's one of the lymphoid tissues. It's involved in the maturation of lymphocytes. All right, adrenal glands. These we also looked at in those cadaver videos, but they're kind of like these little triangular shaped glands that sit right above the kidneys. They're often called the suprarenal glands, and they're actually divided into two functional regions. They're super cool. The outside portion of the adrenal is called the adrenal cortex, similar to the nomenclature for the kidneys. And that's where we're making hormones that regulate your electrolyte level and your nutrient level. So we have what we call mineral corticoids and glucocorticoids. They also regulate inflammatory responses and metabolism. It's also where you make additional androgens. So even females will have testosterone secreted by the adrenal glands. So that's the outside layer. That's what we call the adrenal cortex. And then the middle layer, which is called the adrenal medulla, is really an extension of your fight or flight portion of your nervous system. And so you actually will have direct connections to the sympathetic nervous system, and it will be stimulating the release of epinephrine, or also known as adrenaline. So you wonder where adrenaline gets its name from. It's secreted from the adrenal medulla, and it basically mimics the fight or flight neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, so, or they call noradrenaline. So it really is an extension of the sympathetic nervous system. So this is looking at a frontal view. So they've kind of cut it in a coronal frontal view, so you can see the cortex there. And that's where we'd be making our mineral corticoids and glucocorticoids. The glucocorticoids are involved in the inflammatory response and nutrient metabolism, and also our androgens. And then the adrenal medulla is where we would be making our epinephrine or adrenaline. All right, the kidney, we've also talked about the kidney. The kidney, obviously, its main function is going to be homeostatically regulating the water and electrolyte composition of our blood. But it also, because it receives so much blood flow, it's a really great place to put a monitor that regulates basically the amount of blood cells, the level of oxygenation, and therefore is a really great place to have a hormone that stimulates red blood cell production. So if the kidneys receive a decreased level of blood oxygen, then they will release this hormone called erythropoietin that travels to the bone marrow and stimulates our hemopoietic cells, right, our blood producing cells, to increase the production of our red blood cells, or our erythrocytes. So then you'd have a higher oxygen carrying capacity. So erythropoietin is the hormone, and it's secreted in response to low blood oxygen content. So its job is to increase the oxygen carrying capacity of your blood by stimulating the production of more erythrocytes. Okay? So the endocrine cells here are going to be interstitial fibroblasts. So you're going to have between the renal tubules, you can have interstitial cells that do that job. All right, the pancreas, we've also already talked about the pancreas. We did so as part of our digestive system, but we also mentioned that even though 99% of what the pancreas is doing is releasing digestive enzymes called exocrine, it does have these small little islets of Langerhans that are going to be secreting a suite of hormones involved in nutrient regulation and growth. So the two primary ones that we talk about are insulin and glucagon. Those are released from the islets of Langerhans, and their primary role is nutrient regulation. So specifically, we look at glucose, but in fact, it would be all nutrients. So we're looking at proteins and as well as fats. But insulin's job is to mobilize and move glucose into tissue so it can store and use that nutrient. And glucagon's job is to stimulate the release of stored sugars to make them available for organs and tissues. So we see them balancing blood sugar levels, right? So that's the pancreas islets of Langerhans. And again, those little islets of Langerhans make about 1% of the pancreas's active cells. All right, the ovaries, we spent a lot of time looking at the ovaries. This is kind of a nice end lecture. So we're looking at a lot of stuff we've already seen. Remember, the ovaries have around the cortex, basically it's laden with these quiescent follicular cells. When those follicular cells are stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone, which in fact is released by the pituitary gland, the follicle stimulating hormone will cause the follicular cells to start making estrogen. And then after ovulation, the luteinizing hormone, which is also released by the pituitary gland, is going to stimulate those remaining follicular cells to produce progesterone. So we have follicular cells doing that production of both estrogen and progesterone. Their activities can be regulated by our master gland or our endocrine gland, that being the pituitary. All right. And then last but not least, of the 11 major glands, we're going to look at the testis. And remember that the testis role is to house the cells responsible for making sperm and then also producing testosterone. So remember, it's jam-packed with little tiny seminiferous tubules. Between those little seminiferous tubules are going to be your interstitial cells or your Leydig cells, and those are going to make testosterone. So, all right, so those are the major 11. And what we're going to do now is spend a tiny bit of time looking at how how cool the pituitary gland is. So the pituitary gland, like I mentioned, is referred to as the master endocrine gland because of just the sheer number of hormones it produces and then just the extent of control it has over our body and the connection it has to the nervous system. So it is the master gland for many reasons. It's also referred to as the hypophysis, and hypo means below and physis means growth. So we're looking at the neural tube growing, and you're looking at a 3-week-old embryo and it's starting to develop into a brain. The hypophysis is pituitary gland that grows below the brain, right? This growing brain. And remember, the pineal gland is the epiphysis, which is above. All right, so the pituitary gland is going to basically be an outgrowth from the posterior aspect of the diencephalon. So here we see the hypothalamus, and here's the outgrowth. This is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is going to be divided into an anterior and a posterior pituitary. In humans, we have a middle portion that becomes relatively vestigial in humans. In some other organisms, it's actually quite active in making a hormone called melanocyte stimulating hormone. So organisms that can change color and things like that would use this hormone. We don't use it very much in humans anymore. It does change overall pigmentation. So for example, in pregnancy, we see a darkening of skin because of the melanocyte stimulating hormone. In humans, we most often will say that that middle layer actually becomes incorporated into the anterior pituitary. So really only talk about two lobes, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. All right, so the anterior pituitary is this group here. This is the side that's going to be making 7 pure hormones. And the posterior pituitary is really this outgrowth from the brain. And it's simply going to be releasing technically neurotransmitters, but because they're released in the blood, we'll call them hormones, that are produced by basically neuroendocrine cells that are residing within the hypothalamus and extend. So with that, I have here functions to secrete 9 hormones. It makes 7. So naming them, I'm not going to require that you name them all, but we're looking at thyroid stimulating hormone. So the pituitary gland is going to control the thyroid gland. And remember, the thyroid gland makes thyroxine and calcitonin. So we're looking at the thyroid stimulating hormone. This will be functioning to regulate the thyroxine, which is a metabolic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it's a big word to kind of take a bite of, but when you break it down, it's adrenocortico. So you're talking about the adrenal cortex. So this is a hormone that functions to stimulate the adrenal cortex's production of our glucocorticoids. Follicle stimulating hormone, we already know about that one, both functions in both men and women, stimulating the production of our sex cells. So we're looking at the hormone that will be stimulating spermatogenesis in males and the oogenesis in females. Luteinizing hormone also functions in both male and female, stimulating hormone production. Prolactin does function in both males and females, but we see it having a really important role in females in lactation or production of milk. Growth hormone obviously has a role in both both genders. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, which we typically just associate with the anterior pituitary. And then I have an asterisk next to oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, because those are the two that are released through the pituitary but are actually made by the hypothalamus. All right, so this is out of your textbook. And again, if we look at these little green fibers over here, we call these neuroendocrine cells. So the soma is sitting in nuclei within the hypothalamus, and the axons will extend down into the pituitary gland. So we call this connection the infundibulum. It's kind of fun and it's under, in. So anyway, and these will release the um, neurotransmitters that they make into the capillary bed. And so we're going to have to change their name and say, well, now they're not neurotransmitters, but rather hormones. So ADH and oxytocin, you can see ADH has effects on the kidney, and oxytocin is going to have effect in both males and females. In males, it's all about contraction of the smooth muscle associated with the prostate and the vas deferens. And in females, it's contraction of muscle associated with the uterus and mammary tissue. All right, and then we have these guys, which are controlling glands throughout the body. So you can see here adrenal, thyroid, this will be growth hormones, mammary tissue, affect the liver, storage of blood glucose and things like that. Here we have testis as well as ovary. All right, so for the pituitary gland, we have two major glands within it. So we have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. We'll look at the anterior pituitary, and it's also referred to as the adenohypophysis, and or sometimes called the pars distalis. And the posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis. Neuro meaning it's basically just an outgrowth of the hypothalamus. Sometimes I'll call the pars nervosa because it's part of the nervous system. All right, so anterior pituitary is going to be obviously in front, and the posterior pituitary is going to be behind, right? So posterior pituitary is going to be really just releasing rather than secreting hormones. The anterior pituitary actually making and secreting hormones. All right, so I really like this drawing because it simplifies what we're doing. So green, these guys are neuroendocrine cells. So they are neurons, so they have soma and dendrites, they have axons, so these would be producing action potentials. And then what they're going to be releasing from their terminal endings are biologically active molecules. And then normally you would call them neurotransmitters, but they're going to be released in capillary beds. And so it says here, these neurons produce hormones. Like, what? So they produce hormones because of what they're released into. So instead of releasing onto a target cell where there's going to be receptors for them on the target cells, like we would see with a neuron, releasing it into a synaptic cleft, here we're going to be releasing into basically capillaries, which will pick up those biologically active molecules and then circulate them to often quite distant locations in the body. They can be short too. So these are these neuroendocrine cells that are going to be controlling the anterior pituitary. These guys are going to make releasing hormones that will actually orchestrate what gets released, synthesized, and released from the anterior pituitary. All right, so what regulates the pituitary as a whole are going to be these cells that sit in the hypothalamus. Okay? And again, this extension of the hypothalamus into the pituitary is called the infundibulum. All right, so let's look really quickly at the posterior pituitary. Here we have these hypothalamic neurons. So again, these are neurons, they're neuroendocrine cells, and they're going to have soma that sit in nuclei within the hypothalamus. So we'll have some paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei, and they will then be receiving signals coming in from nervous tissue. And in response to that, they will send action potentials that release hormones that are made by these cells but stored in the terminal endings. So you're going to see, in this case, you're looking at the hormone is made and packaged in the soma. It's going to be transported to the terminal ending. And what we're going to find is that the action potentials that stimulate them are going to be produced by these cells, travel down the axons, and then cause the release. Okay? So again, even though these are neurons, we'll call the product a hormone because it's released into a capillary that then carries these hormones to the rest of the body. So the cell bodies are in the hypothalamus. The axons run down through the infundibulum, right? This extension. And then the synaptic knobs are sitting in the posterior pituitary. So this is where the hormones get released. All right, so the hypothalamus is really doing the job of synthesizing, and then the posterior pituitary is going to be releasing. So the hormones are released into the posterior pituitary capillaries. And again, there's two, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Right, so here we can see if we're looking at the posterior pituitary, you just have capillaries here. You have these neurosecretory, neuroendocrine cells, and then we can carry this off to distant tissues. So oxytocin is going to function to stimulate smooth muscle. And we're going to see that antidiuretic hormone is going to be affecting our collecting duct within our kidneys. All right, so when we look at the control, remember when we did our second lecture in our nervous system, any collection of axons within the central nervous system, we call it tract. So here, these axons that are traveling through the infundibulum, we call a tract. So we have a hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. I know it's a lot of words to say, but it's really just saying, hey, I'm talking about these axons. They're sitting in the hypothalamus, right? The soma in the hypothalamus. So we have the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei. So the soma up here, they have axons that travel down through the infundibulum, and then they end in their terminal ending. So notice it says axon terminals, where they release their, in this case again, hormone. Okay, so this is the hypothalamic hypophyseal. So remember, the old name of the pituitary gland is hypophysis, meaning below the growth, physis meaning growth. So hypothalamo hypophyseal tract. It's kind of cool. All right. So now let's swing to the anterior pituitary, and it's a very different mechanism. So here we're going to see that still the hypothalamus is controlling the activity, but instead of producing the hormones directly released by the pituitary gland, they're going to be producing, this is going to sound strange, they're going to be producing releasing hormones, which is kind of cool here. So notice we have our hypothalamic neurons, there's lots of them. And there's a capillary bed that's sitting here in the beginning of the infundibulum. And then we're going to see that the releasing hormones are going to travel a very short distance into the anterior pituitary and stimulate the anterior pituitary gland cells to release their hormones. So if you remember, when we talked about our hepatic portal vein, I said that a portal vessel was basically where you have a capillary bed, and then you have a set of vessels that goes into another capillary bed before going back to the heart, right? So when we looked at the digestive system, we had all these great capillaries absorbing nutrients. And then when the blood vessels ran back toward the heart, they had to go through the liver. And so the blood vessels connecting the digestive system to the liver before we got to the heart was called a portal system. So that's why we use this term portal. So here we're going to have a group of capillaries at the beginning of the infundibulum, and then we're going to have a group of capillaries that's sitting in the anterior pituitary. So in the infundibulum is where we're going to have our portal vessels. So they're going to carry the releasing hormones from the hypothalamic neurons through the infundibulum through blood vessels. So these are all portal vessels, and into the into the anterior pituitary to make those 7 different anterior pituitary hormones. So I know that's a mouthful, but the hypothalamic neurons are going to be making neurosecretory cells, or they're going to be neurosecretory cells, and they're going to be releasing hormones. So here's a nice view of that. So here's the capillary bed that sits right at the beginning of the infundibulum. Over here, these are our cells that are getting producing the releasing hormones. They secrete a hormone in this little capillary bed here. They travel through these portal vessels. So these are releasing hormones to these cells, and they tell these cells what to release. So if you want the thyroid gland to release thyroxine, you have to have your hypothalamic cells release thyroid stimulating hormone, releasing hormone, and that then runs through the portal vessels to the anterpituitary, that then releases thyroid stimulating hormone, that then travels to the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Okay, so same thing would be true for, let's say, follicle stimulating hormone. So let's say you want the follicles in the ovary to develop. You want follicle stimulating hormone to be released by the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus has to release follicle stimulating hormone, releasing hormone into these little capillaries that then travels through the portal vessels to the anterior pituitary. So the follicle stimulating hormone, releasing hormone, then stimulates the release of follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, that then goes down to the ovary and stimulates the ovary. All right, so I have here another view. So here axons to primary capillaries. So we see here, these are basically neuroendocrine cells. They're making hormones we release into this primary capillary bed. Then we go through our portal vessels to our secondary capillary bed. So here, we're going to refer to this side as a portal system versus this side as a tract. Okay. All right, so the releasing hormones are going to be carried to the anterpituitary, where we're going to see the anterpituitary is going to be making 7 different kinds of hormones that then get released and carried out to our target cells. Okay, so the infundibulum is going to have these portal vessels going from one capillary bed to another. All right, so the releasing hormones stimulate production of the 7 other hormones. So this is just an example. Here are neurosecretory cells. They're going to be releasing into the primary capillary, down the portal vessels, and then into the anterpituitary to then release all of these hormones. So for each one of these, there has to be a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So that's what it's showing here. Releasing hormones from the hypothalamus are then going to cause the stimulation of the anterpituitary hormones. Okay, so the anterior pituitary hormones are then released into that secondary plexus, and then those are carried out through the entire body through those veins that are going to be going into our surrounding tissues. All right, so the anterior pituitary is going to be called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system versus the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract system. So this is actually out of, and this is a very old image because this is out of my old textbook. So I really liked it. Anyway, so these are the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the posterior pituitary, in green, and these would then be moving down tracts to the infundibulum and releasing hormones directly into the primary capillary bed in the posterior pituitary, versus the hypothalamic neurons they're releasing into the primary capillary bed. They're going to release releasing hormones into the anterior pituitary for the anterior pituitary cells to then make and release the 7 other pituitary hormones. Okay, so we have a portal system on the anterior side, and we have a tract system on the posterior side. All right, so that's it with the endocrine system. So watch, I put a quick little video up. There's actually lots of videos you can watch.